Looks like a change of venue.
Yeah, I moved out of the living room so that I could have a little bit more support from this chair at a proper desk and use the fancy microphone that we have. How's the sound? Good?
Excellent.
Good? Excellent. Okay.
You sound like a radio host.
Yeah, well, it's nice. I don't have to shout as much actually to be heard.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good morning, Nancy. Nice to see you. Hi, everyone.
And the mic makes you look like a radio host.
Yeah, it makes me feel like one too.
So get out the guitar.
Yeah, the guitar's in the shop, unfortunately.
No.
Okay, my friends. I'm very happy to pick up right where we left off, which was in the first few chapters or the first few sections of chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot. I'll mute you. We'll bless. We'll get started. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So a couple words just by way of reintroducing us to where we are. We're in the second chapter of Pirkei Avot in our ongoing study of Mishnah. The chapter begins with a statement attributed to a figure called just Rabbi in the text. Rabbi is Rabbi Judah Hanasi, who is the celebrated compiler of the Mishnah, the lead exponent of his generation, which was the 5th generation of the rabbinic colony or the rabbinic community that was established originally in Yavne at the conclusion of the failed Jewish rebellion against Rome in the early 70s of the Common Era. And so now we're 5 generations down the road, and we're still following the theme of chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot, learning from the master teachers of our tradition a series of axioms about how we would define a life well lived on Jewish terms. And that's the theme that's established in chapter 2. What is the meaning? What is the way that a person should follow? What is the meaning of a good life in a particularly Jewish context? So we spent a lot of our time unpacking just the first 2 statements, the first 2 Mishnayot of Pirkei Avot chapter 2, and we're going to pick up right at chapter 2, section 3, which I will momentarily share on screen. So just hold that thought. Here we go. Okay. Sharing on screen. So here is the text from last week. Rabbi said, which is the straight path that a man should choose for himself? And we unpacked that and the following statement, which is attributed to one Rabban Gamliel Beno Shel Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, which is his son, Rabban Gamliel. It seems that there were multiple Rabban Gamliels. This is the one who was the last of the early Rabban Gamliels, the son of Rabbi Judah Hanasi. And right now, it seems that the rabbis are kind of doing this balancing act, or in encouraging a balancing act, wherein a person is invited to have a meaningful and consistent attention to the study of Torah and the performance of mitzvot, but not at the total expense or to the neglect of worldly concerns, right? So the main dialectic that's established in the first 2 Mishnayot is between the fact that people need to have an occupation. There needs to be toil spent in the real world alongside Torah. And getting the balance right is what the rabbis are after. And I think we had a number of meaningful, they're not digressions because they were on topic, but about the Haredi path, the way in which the ultra-Orthodox, at least from our outside looking in perspective, seem to skew very heavily into the study all the time, only study, worldly occupation is much diminished and even disparaged in that world, for menfolk anyway, which appears in contradistinction to what these texts are teaching. But again, I caution with the disclaimer that this is from the outside looking in. We are not Haredi, so we don't really have the full context or milieu in which they operate for our understanding of why they do what they do. And I think that I suspect that the Haredi will come up again today, but I just want to add a second disclaimer, which is that I'm hardly an expert in Haredi life. So why don't we pick up here at chapter 3, which is a short one. I'll start in Hebrew and translate as we go. I'm picking up right here where my cursor is flashing. Hevu zihirin barashut. Be careful around the authorities. Here it says, be careful in your dealings with the ruling authorities. Rashut, Maimonides teaches us, is the word that the early rabbinic commonwealth used to refer to the secular government. So remember that Judea is a colony of Rome at this point, and that the cities of ancient Judea, of our biblical homeland, where the rabbis were communing and doing their rabbi thing, up in the Galilee, this is in the northern part of Israel, what is today Israel, were at this time living in a place that was recently called Palestina or Palestine, which was a Roman dig at the indigenous Jews, naming it after their worst enemies, the Philistines. So these rabbis who were living in Eretz Yisrael or Palestine, in our biblical homeland, had many dealings with the secular authorities. And Judah HaNasi, that title that is given to the chief rabbi who is identified at the top of chapter 2, means that he was also the designated liaison between the Jewish community and the secular authorities. HaNasi means the ruler or the president or the prince. He's sometimes called Judah the Prince, but it's not a title of royalty. It's more an honorable designation of station in society. So Judah HaNasi, the Nasi, sometimes the Nasi is translated the patriarch. You'll see all of these terms variously translated at the word, attempting to get at the meaning of the word Nasi. So Judah HaNasi was the patriarch, the prince, the ruler, but really what he was the appointed emissary between the rabbinic commonwealth, the Jewish commonwealth at the time, and the ruling Roman authorities. So Judea was effectively a vassal colony to Rome. Certain aspects of public religion were permitted, but many had been a source of, kind of tension between the Jews and the Romans. And yet archaeologists have convincingly demonstrated that in many places, like the cities of Tzipori or Beit Sharim or Beit Shan, where Rabbi Judah HaNasi actually finished the last part of his life, all had Jewish populations, Christian populations, and pagan Roman populations all interacting. So you would have Jews going to the marketplace and buying from Roman vendors. You'd have Romans buying from Jews. You had nascent or early Christians, some of whom also called themselves Jews. So it's actually a much more sophisticated and complex picture than sometimes we are led to believe. So you have these rabbis who are living at a time where they have quite some interchange in daily commerce, presumably in dialogue and thought, maybe not in any organized way, but there's no way that Jews, Romans, and Christians were not interacting and sharing with one another. And it seems fairly harmoniously in that we don't have any record of a kind of internecine violence in these cities from this period. Jews would pay their taxes. The taxes would go to the Romans. The Romans had installed, and this goes back all the way. We're going back for 200 years before this period. The Romans had been governing by installing a local procurator or governor over the province. So, some of the procurators whose names you might know include Herod, probably the most famous, or Pontius Pilate. Those are figures who pop up in both testaments. They are the Roman ruling authority in Judea. Anyway, it's a long way of saying that the Jews did have occasion to interact with the Romans, who were the ruling authorities at the time. And here in this little handbook for budding rabbis, for rabbis in training, you have this very intriguing cautionary statement. Be careful in your dealings with the ruling authorities. And it goes on to explain why. She'ein mekorvin lo la'adam, for they would not draw close to a person, so they don't have any need to have some kind of close relationship with another person, ela letzorech atzman, unless they want something out of it, right? Except for their own needs. So be careful. If a Roman authority comes up to you and wants to be your buddy, you should view this with quite some suspicion, because the ruling authorities have no reason to be chummy with the Jews unless they stand to benefit in some material way from it. It goes on to say, Nir'in ke'ohavin b'sha'at hana'atan. They seem like they are your friends when it's in their own interest, at the time that it serves them. Ve'en omdin lo la'adam b'sha'at dochko. But they will not stand by you when you are in need. They will turn as soon at the drop of a hat if their own needs dictate it. So don't trust the Romans, don't trust the ruling authorities. They do not have your best interest, presumably as a Jew, and they will abandon you in your time of need. Would anyone like to reflect on this text or offer any other comments? What does this suggest, or what questions does this prompt?
It could be the seeds of what you find today with maybe the Hasidic communities sort of being more concerned about their own community and less, and feeling that they are less required to follow the rules of the governing body.
Well, I guess in that way, it does go both ways. I think that this is also establishing that so I appreciate the analogy that the primary fealty that Jews should be concerned with is to Judaism, Jewish law, and the rabbinic authority. So some of this is, look who's writing this, right? The rabbis are writing this. So the rabbis are understandably distrustful of the secular authorities, in part because it's a hedge against their own authority for the community. So the rabbis have a vested interest in being seen as the authoritative stipulants of the norms of Jewish life. And you know, in many of these ancient communities, it was not uncommon for different sects, different religious groups, different peoples within a mixed society to be given the authority by the Romans to practice their own religion with minimal disruption from the authorities, and even to carry out their own system of justice. And this actually does happen to some extent in Hasidic communities. You know, there's this tension, this dialectic between, am I a citizen of the state, beholden first and foremost to the law of the land, or am I a Jew, beholden first and foremost to the law of my faith and my community? And the answer is, well, both, right? The Talmud has a statement that comes up several times and is probably one of the most quoted statements from the Talmud. In Aramaic, the line is Dina de Malchuta Dina. So it's just three words, Dina de Malchuta Dina, which means the law of the land. Dina is the law. De Malchuta, like from Malchut, from Melech, the law of the realm. Dina is the law. And this has been a very important Jewish precept throughout history. It was the rabbi's way of saying that in whatever diaspora community you find yourself as Jewish people, as a Jewish community, you are still subject to the laws of the land. Part of the Jewish strategy for success in a predominantly diaspora experience of our Jewish civilization, in other words, Jewish civilization for all of rabbinic history and most of Jewish history, has taken place in the milieu of diaspora and without sovereignty. I know that that's strange coming one week as it does after the 73rd anniversary of Israel's statehood, but we are living in astonishing times compared against the broad picture of the history of the Jewish civilization, right? Having sovereign power in our biblical homeland is something that for most of Jewish history was out of reach. It was always desired, it was always remembered from our biblical past, but it was not actually attained or attainable. And therefore, Jews had to figure out strategies for getting on in the diaspora world where we did not have power. And in many cases, not only did we not have power, we did not have all sorts of agency, rights, privileges that Gentile society would take for granted, whether that means the ability to own land, or to have, or to be able to join an artisan guild, or to marry the person of our choosing, or to pay the same taxes, receive the same wages, to say nothing of other opportunities that were barred from Jews. And I think most of this is known to us, so I don't need to elaborate too much. But the point is that Jews have always had to do this dance, this balancing act between, well, to what extent is my primary responsibility to Jewish law, and to what extent is my primary responsibility to the law of the land? And the rabbis made it clear that the answer is yes, both. And you have to find a way to balance both. And that may inform the statement we're looking at, because the rabbis know that you can't not deal with the secular authorities at all. We are not being instructed by the rabbis to function as a cult, right? Taking up guns, holding ourselves up. We're not anti-government the way some religious wackos, including in recent memory in America, have presented themselves as being. Jews have always, I think, tried to succeed by being model citizens. If you really want to understand Jewish history in America, I think it's mostly the story of a people striving to be model citizens and to assimilate. That further highlights the contrast that Audrey points out, that at least in some places, certain Hasidic sects, and again, even Hasidim is a blanket term, an umbrella term that encompasses so many different kinds of Hasidim, right? So there are Hasidim who are, I would say, Chabad Lubavitch is actually pretty well embracing of modernity and really try to be pretty good citizens. Whereas the Satmar community, they're the folks in Kiryas Yoel and other parts in Crown Heights, with the fur streimels and the stockings. The Satmar community is much more extreme in its views and has at times clashed with the secular authorities. And this comes up at the local level when it comes to, what is the responsibility to a school board, for instance, or public education in communities that are predominantly Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. How do they balance? Right now, the vaccine issues have really provided a kind of bright line that has divided certain Jews against other Jews, because some Jews think that their primary responsibility is to listen to what their rabbis are telling them about the vaccine, which often is, or mask policy. Don't wear a mask, come to this wedding of the noted Rebbe and his daughter, and there will be 10,000 of us Hasidim in the streets. And it's a public health nightmare. And that can only come about if you believe that your primary responsibility is to the rabbi, even in defiance of civil law or ordinances or whatever, New York protocols are for COVID. So I think that this is very meaningful to explore in the context of vaccine compliance, mask compliance, even in our current context, lest we think that by reading this 2,000-year-old text that it's all just archaeology and we only have to look at it in its present, in its context back then. It's good to look at it in its context today as well and just see how these dilemmas continue to present for Jewish people in certain parts of Jewish life. Ivan and Judy, will you unmute yourselves, please?
Okay.
Oh, okay. First of all, congratulations, because you've answered virtually all the questions that I had
Great.
about the total survival of the.
Good. That means that I can have a nosh from my brunch. So keep going. I'm listening.
But you still have to answer one question, because the rabbis are the rabbis, and they're an elite, and the top of them are the elite of the elite. And what I still don't understand is, how does the word of the elite gets disseminated to a population over the ages, but particularly in the first 200-300 years, when most of the population, not only was it mixed in this Christian, Judeo, and soup, if you wish, but they were uneducated. I would call them analphabets, but that's a word that's not typically used here. They're not they're illiterate, and yet, over the centuries they follow, and not just the Hasidim, but the Negotiants, and the entire Jewish population follows in a way that is so different from most other cultures that were conquered, integrated, and perhaps happily intermarried. So I asked myself, is oppression of the Jews and persecution in a way of the Jews, in a weird way, saving the Jewish culture?
Yeah, wonderful observations and a good question. Look, nobody really knows, but I think your presumptions about the literacy or the illiteracy of the masses is well taken, though there's some scholarship that would suggest that within the Jewish community, literacy and scholarship, being prized as they are, may have produced a somewhat more literate community, a more lettered community than their pagan counterparts or even their Christian counterparts. But having said that, I think the presumption, the framework, as we've said, for Pirkei Avot is this is a handbook by rabbis for rabbis. The entire context, and there are so many allusions to this. I think that the book, the Pirkei Avot especially, does not make a whole lot of sense unless it is read as the words of the elite rabbis of their generations, having collected these wise statements and then actively using these statements in the training of the next generations of rabbis, of their successors. And it's very self-consciously attentive to that dynamic, right? The text itself makes many references to the transmission of the tradition and the responsibility of teacher to disciple or master to pupil. So then the question is, well, then what happened to this material? How did it get, I think your word was disseminated, right? How did the seeds get planted? And that becomes a matter of conjecture. And I'm sure that the scholarship on this is out there, but I haven't read it. From what I understand, I think the assumption is that the rabbis who are now being, asked to saturate themselves in rabbinic teaching go out into their communities and are the adjudicators of matters of Jewish law and the teachers of Jewish tradition, right? That's why the Talmud, and I point this out often, stipulates that the base qualifications for a rabbi are framed on the ordination language, framed in the language of smicha, or rabbinic ordination, as yoreh yoreh yadin yadin. This one is qualified to teach. This one is qualified to judge. So these rabbis were being trained as teachers and judges for the Jewish community, and which also means, apropos my previous point, that presuming that a number of matters the Roman authorities would just leave to the Jews to decide on their own, like somebody stole a chicken from another Jew, that wouldn't be a matter for the civil authorities, right? That would be a matter for your own religious authorities. So you go to the rabbi, and the rabbi would, consult the source or the sources and say, here's the penalty. And that's what the Mishnah, we're reading Pirkei Avot, which is kind of these wise maxims. And I think of it as kind of a meta text about rabbinic teaching, because it's a teaching text about teaching itself. But you recall, if you've been with us since the start of our deep exploration of Mishnah, that Mishnah is here to cover everything, right? So there's a whole order of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is comprised of 6 orders. 6 are the orders of the Mishnah. Each order is called a Seder. Each Seder comprises multiple or contains many tractates or masechtot. Each masechet is on a different subject of Jewish interest. So there's a Masechet Sukkah, which is all about the rules of Sukkot. But there's also a whole order called Nizikin, which is damages, right? And so it's all about torts and fines and how you determine these things, but that would not be for the Roman authorities to determine. So where I'm going with this is that my presumption in all of this is that the Jews, the illiterate masses, still had need of their rabbis in their community and would ultimately would be consulting the rabbis on a case-by-case daily basis. The rabbis were very much integrated into the flow of Jewish life. Moreover, when there were public gatherings of the Jewish people on the Sabbath, on Torah reading days, on the holidays, one can imagine the rabbis not being very good at holding their tongues, but rather using these opportunities to preach to and teach the community. Again, we don't know much about early rabbinic era preaching customs, so it's really up for conjecture. But my guess is that this is what happened in synagogues, this is what happened in public, and this is what happened anytime a rabbi was consulted. So the rabbi was the authority, but only rabbis in training would get the deep dive into the text and would, become lettered. And exactly how that worked, was it a pure meritocracy, or was it kind of a, certain families, the expectation was that all the boys would grow up to be rabbis? I really don't know. But there's also an expectation that a bricklayer is not allowed to be ignorant of Jewish law, right? That somehow these teachings had to reach the people. Okay, let's carry on. This was a nice, meaningful, not digression, but deepening. So as we look now at the next text, so just be wary around the ruling authorities. You didn't realize we could do a half hour on that alone, but it's a lot, right? I mean, because it requires that we have a visual, we have an image in our minds of a Jewish community that is forced into interaction with the secular authorities. Now we're going to talk about God. We start with this common rabbinic phrase, Hu haya omer. He used to say. Who's the he? Well, it's the same one we had before. So we got to go all the way up to number 2. The last rabbi who has been mentioned is this Rabban Gamliel, son of Rabbi Judah Hanasi. So it's the same rabbi. Hu haya omer, aseh ritzono chirtzonecha. Do his will as if it were your will. His is always God in this case. So do God's will as if it were your own. Well, how do you know God's will? You know God's will because the rabbis tell you what it is, and because you have the texts, and because you have the Torah. So again, an illiterate person would have to come to a rabbi and say, well, okay, do God's will, teach me, right? What am I supposed to do? So the rabbis are basically saying, look, you get up, it's Saturday morning, you've been toiling like a beast all week. All you want to do is laze out in the sun, have some hummus and pita. But Judaism tells you you've got to get up early and go to shul and daven. Do God's will as if it were your own. In other words, your priority, and this is all still stemming from the idea of the derekh yashara, the right path or the straight path for a person to take that we've been exploring since chapter 2, section 1. What is the right path? Well, the right path involves setting your own needs aside or placing your own desires behind God's will. And if you need access to God's will, as I have said, we have it right here in the text. So do God's will as if it were your own. And if you do that, I love the way that this is very poetic language. It's chiasm, right? ABC, CBA it's a literary structure. If you do God's will as your own, the end result, the end result is that your will be like God's will. God will make your will into God's will, which is really interesting. It's sort of it's a little bit too close for my comfort, to the cosmic vending machine theory of how people interact with God. If I do what God wants, God will do what I want. But that's what the text promises. Batel ritzoncha mipnei ritzono kedei sheyivatel ritzon acherim mipnei ritzonecha. So these are all, there's a poetry in the language, and then I'll get Russell's comment, which I think is intended to make these function as mnemonics, right? They're easy to remember because they have a lilt, a rhyme, and a meter, in their own way. So the second phrase, batel ritzoncha, cancel out your own desire. In other words, put aside what you want, mipnei ritzono, in the face of what God wants, in the face of God's will. Ratzon is will. Kedei sheyivatel ritzon acherim, so that God will cancel out the desire of others in the face of your desire. In other words, the reward for following God and the Jewish path instead of just doing willy-nilly whatever you want is that God will actually cause you to prosper by allowing your dreams to come true, your wishes to come true, while those who design against you or those who are perhaps have needs of their own will fall lower on God's priority list. Right? If God has to take care of the entire Jewish people, how are we going to ensure that God takes care of what I want? The best way to ensure that, says Rabban Gamliel ben Judah Hanasi, is that you follow the law, do what God wants, and God will provide. Okay, Russell, I'm sure that you don't agree with the statement, but I'm curious to see how you parse it.
Well, it would have been a lot worse if it had said it the other way around. If it had said, do your will as if it were God's, that to me would have been a license to kill. By saying do God's will as if it...
I'm sorry, I accidentally muted you when I meant to hit the lower hand function. Please forgive me.
Oh, okay.
Pick up
No,
where you
I was saying it would have been really scary if it had been the other way around. If it had said, do your will as if it were God's, it would truly be a license to kill. You could literally justify every whim by saying this is God's will. By phrasing it as they have, I think there is a very benign and even elevating interpretation, which is do it with all your heart. In other words, when you're doing God's will, don't just go through the motions, but do it as if it comes from yours. And what fascinates me about this is that just as man is created in the image of God, there is a will, an instinct in man that is a kind of baby version of God's will. And I think it's admonishing us to find that flame within ourselves. There are other, I'd say, more pernicious ways of looking at all of this, because it does require one to make certain assumptions about what God's will is. But as I say, I am fascinated at the way it depicts human nature as being a sort of junior version of God's will.
I like this very much, and it echoes what there's an famous comment on this Mishnah, on this text, by one Rabbi Jonah, one of the Talmudic sages, who says the meaning of this phrase is that there should be no distinction between the will of the Holy One of blessing and one's own will. Both should be the same. In other words, the idea is about bringing your own heart's desires into alignment with what, as it were, the heart of the Holy One wants from you and from humankind, or from, at least from the Jewish people. So the idea is about aligning self-interest with divine interest. And that, again, is an answer to the question, what is the derekh yeshara that a person should follow? What is the straight path for a person? It is the one where one's own desires are in as close as possible alignment with the will of the Holy One of blessing. Other comments? Yes, Ivan, please.
Okay, it reminds me of the Greek gods who conveniently, when they felt, or when the people who prayed for their help, imputed powers and human characteristics that meshed very much, kind of like what Russell was talking about. You see, there is almost like a blending, and I just wonder whether, you know, over the ages, from the Greeks to the Romans and into the caves, etc., this idea about God or a God or the king of the gods, Zeus, stands ready to help you when you are ready to be helped in a way that pleases God.
You know, it's a fascinating lens through which to consider what's being taught here. I'm more drawn, to be honest, to contrast rather than similarity. To me, so there are some significant contrasts to the way in which the relationship between the mortals and the gods in Greek and Roman literature, mythology, are presented. To it, the gods are notoriously capricious and impulsive. They follow their own, often sexual and violent impulses, and often wreak havoc and create disaster for us mortals. And the only access to the gods in certain mythologies is often provided through oracles and whatnot, and divination of various sorts. And I think the rabbis are at pains because they recognize that actually some of those threads, some of those strands are also visible in the way the divine human relationship, and particularly the character of God, is portrayed in the Hebrew scriptures. Also prone to fits of rage, jealousy, and abounding love as well. And sometimes you never know what you're going to get with Yahweh. And what the rabbis are actually trying to do is rewrite the rule book on God, rewrite God's resume, rewrite God's character description to be a God of law, order, and predictability. That you can always predict how God is going to act because God has given us law. And if you just follow the law, all is well with the world. And if you don't, look out. Now that's not just rabbinic. That's really the theology of the book of Deuteronomy. In contrast, you still have biblical authors like the author of Job who says, not so fast. You can be pious, you can do everything right, and God will still kick your ass, right? So it does not say that literally in the book of Job, but I think that's a theme that the book of Job wants to present. Nevertheless, the rabbis, I would say, are more indebted to the God of Deuteronomy, the God of strict measure for measure justice, the God who rewards the good and punishes the bad, even if not in this lifetime, then in the next. And we're going to get to that. We're going to get to questions of God's justice. But I think they want to present us with a God who is uniformly just, also compassionate, and provides people with a measure for measure reward or punishment based on their deeds. And I think that is more of a contrast to at least my limited knowledge of the gods from the pantheons of Greek and Roman civilizations. Dad, are you raising a hand, or are you just giving me a thumbs up because you like what I'm saying?
No, I was just raising my hand, actually.
Great.
I think the way in which this immediately follows the preceding passage is fascinating, because it's like, well, don't trust the Romans or don't trust the ruling authority. Okay, if that's the case, then who should we trust? Well, here's the answer.
Exactly. I also read these as all linked, by the way. I really think that there's a tight narrative cohesion to Pirkei Avot. And that's something that before teaching this class now, because I haven't done a sequential read of Pirkei Avot since I was a fifth-year rabbinical student when I did an independent study on Pirkei Avot, but not really the base text. I was translating and analyzing Maimonides' commentary to Pirkei Avot, which, by the way, is also on Sefaria. If you go to Pirkei Avot on Sefaria, there's another tab for commentaries, which have like 20 different commentaries on the Mishnah, some of which I try to study before I teach on Thursday mornings. And the commentary of the Rambam is wonderful, but I haven't done a sequential read in, 22 years or more. And now that I'm rediscovering this text, I see what you're seeing, which is that the texts really do connect. Sometimes you as the reader have to draw the lines, but I see exactly that. Like, you don't trust the ruling authorities. So again, back to the question, what's the right path? We know what it is. You follow God.
And I also think it's interesting that this is a real early warning against assimilation. I mean, in the previous paragraph, you could read so much. So I want to join the fancy Goyish country club. And the rabbis say, well, be careful. They're only friendly with you because they want something.
Great. And by the way, and that attests further to the image I wanted to place in our minds early in today's class, that at the time these texts are being written, pretty recent scholarship has convincingly demonstrated a whole lot of regular daily public interchange among Jews, Christians, and Romans, at least in some of the cities of northern Israel. Like, that's a really important context for understanding these rabbinic texts that come from that period, right? Because to deal with the secular authorities, to deal with the goyim is not an abstract consideration. This is part of daily life as well. And it ties in also what, the balance between Torah study and secular occupation. It all plays into the same set of themes and concerns. And further, I'm going to use that as my segue to the next line. Now we're back to Hillel. And this is important. Remember that Hillel is a pre-rabbinic figure, right? He comes from the 1st century BCE, and he was mentioned in the chain of teachers who are listed sequentially, often in pairs. Hillel's pair is Shammai, in chapter 1 of Pirkei Avot. So I'm going back to when we were studying this in the late summer and through the fall. We looked at these chains, this chain of teaching, master to pupil, a pair of teachers to their disciples, and the way in which that would cause the teaching to proliferate down the rabbinic generations. You will recall that Hillel was among the more prominent of those early sages. And then what we did is we went from Hillel all the way up to Judah Hanasi and even Judah Hanasi's son. Now, at this point in the narrative, Pirkei Avot has basically listed the entire generation of the original sages. Now that they've all been kind of collected in a linear fashion, the text is going to jump back to Hillel. So we're jumping in time much, much earlier to demonstrate that the early teachings still hold sway over the way in which the rabbis approach the question of Jewish life, or how you are supposed to live the derekh yeshara, the straight path. Hillel said, "Do not separate yourself from the community." A very famous line. It's often pulled out of Pirkei Avot and just used as a kind of single maxim. Al tifrosh min hatzibur. This is the line right here. Al, you can see where I'm circling. Al tifrosh min hatzibur. Do not separate. Peirosh, tifrosh, is a word that means to tear apart or separate. It also, interestingly enough, is the word for exegesis or analysis of text. So perush means to analyze something. How do you analyze something? You tear it apart. Also, parshanut, parasha, is a section of something. In other words, that which is extracted. So I'm having fun with Hebrew right now. Perush, parshanut, and finally the word Pharisees. In Hebrew, the Pharisees are the perushim. Pharisees, perushim, the people who tore apart the text, but not in a disrespectful way, the people who analyze the text section by section by section. But here, the word tifrosh is back to its original meaning as a verb. Do not extract yourself, separate yourself out, tear yourself away from the community, the interests of the public. No person is an island. But Hillel continues. The text doesn't end there. In fact, our translator wanted to give us a comma so that we see how it connects to what follows. Ve'al ta'amin be'atzmecha ad yom motecha. And I'm going to reorder the words here. And up until the day of your death, ad yom motcha, to the day you die, al ta'amin be'atzmecha. Do not place faith in yourself. Ta'amin, believe, faith from the root word amen. Amen, which means to affirm something, right? So if I say a prayer, shehechianu, and everybody else says amen, it's your prayer too. You're like, right on, Rabbi. I affirm that prayer. Amen. It means what we think it means. Amen. Somebody says something, you agree, amen. So al ta'amin, don't amen yourself. Don't put faith in yourself ad yom motecha, up until the very day that you die. Ve'al tadin et chavercha ad shetagia limakomo. And do not judge your fellow human being. It doesn't say fellow man, it says chaver, your fellow, your partner, your friend. Don't judge another person ad shetagia limkomo, until you've arrived in his place. So don't judge another person unless you've stood in his or her shoes. Ve'al tomar devar she'i efshar lishmoa. And do not say something that somebody else will not be able to hear. It doesn't actually say understand. It says lishmoa, from shema. Do not say something impossible to hear, shesofo lehishama, for in the end, thinking that eventually it will be understood, thinking that eventually someone will hear it and heed it. we're going to talk about what all these phrases mean. Hillel was just the Ben Franklin of his time, right? He just had one wise saying after another. Everything that came out of his lips was honey dripping. The al tomar lichashe ipane eshne shema lo tipane. One of my favorite lines. And do not say, when I have leisure, I shall study. Perhaps you will not have leisure. One of the core teachings that was affirmed in my personal experience and in my kishkas during my sabbatical, that I've spent too many of the 21 years that I've been a rabbi saying, I will study when I have the time, as opposed to saying, if I want to be if I want to really be sincere in my practice as a rabbi, and if I want to be a good rabbi, I need to make sure that my study is fixed and not discretionary. And so that's changed the way I think about my schedule. Obviously, there are certain times when the rabbi has to be on call for the needs of his or her congregants. Somebody's in distress, somebody has experienced the death of a loved one, then the rabbi should be there. But I've decided that my practice of setting aside time for study, and not just teaching, but real study, is now going to be a part of my weekly practice. And the good news is, actually, even before sabbatical, it has been for the last year. I've basically not missed a week. And that really has changed my attitude. It's bolstered my mood and my constitution. So I hope that you feel that part of the reason these classes are enjoyable is because I'm energized around the text. And I hope I communicate some of my energy for this to you. So anyway, Hillel speaks to me. I hope he speaks to you too. It's actually not just for rabbis, though. And this is another question where Ivan's inquiry is trenchant, although I don't have a definitive answer. Is Hillel speaking only to rabbis, that only rabbis should say, I will make time for study, rather than when I have leisure, I will study? Or is it for everyone? Not clear. I view Hillel as more of a populist in his approach to Jewish living. I've always felt, and Hillel wasn't a rabbi himself, remember. This is before the term rabbi was ever used. That's why it's improper to refer to him as Rabbi Hillel. He's a sage. He's clearly revered and looked up to by his successors who are rabbis. But in the 1st century BCE, that term had not yet become the thing that you use to refer to your teacher. Thoughts or questions on anything that Hillel has said? So we're taking the text from here on down. How does it connect to what we've already learned? How do you parse Hillel's admonition not to separate yourself from the community, not to judge others until you've stood in their place, not to say something that others might not be able to understand, and not to say, I'll study when I have the time, but rather the opposite? How do all of these things kind of land with you? I'm going to acknowledge my dad's digital hand first, and then others who want to chime in can go afterward.
The most provocative part of this, I think, is do not say something that cannot be understood, trusting that in the end it will be understood. I mean, as a parent, what would happen to all my parental advice when we say things like, don't worry about it, you'll figure this out later, but do as I say now?
Right. So, I mean, some of this is, well, I'm not sure that the visual here, that the image here is parent to young child. But yeah, it's okay. So we can just sit with that being a bit of a perplexing phrase. I'm curious to hear if anyone else had a response to it before I chime in with some of the things that came to mind as I was studying this text. Anyone else on this or anything else that Hillel said?
Can I just say one thing just specifically about the word of the translation? Because in my Pirkei Avot, it says, do not say something inappropriate, for it will then be appropriated.
Oh, that's
a little difference in context of everything.
I would say that's a huge difference.
Yeah.
My biggest problem with that is that's not what the text says, but so, on the other, that's okay. We are an interpretive tradition, and translation is a subjective act that always does violence to the author's meaning, right? We know that.
It's crucial.
Right. So, but I will you say it again? Just read what's in your translation, and then I'm going to open my book and see how they render it here in my Koran Pirkei Avot.
Oh, it's the word your father used that made me think that this is not the same exactly.
Good.
Do not say something inappropriate, for it will then be appropriated.
Fascinating. Okay, so what I've got in my book here is do not say anything that cannot be understood, brackets at once. In other words, that's not immediately understandable in the hope that it will eventually be understood. So here's what the footnote says here. This is really quite fascinating. Do not say anything that cannot be understood. Speak clearly and precisely. Do not leave room for misinterpretation or misunderstanding.
Words, 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 my lord, huh?
Right, thank you. Is that
Even-
Polonius? Is that Hamlet and Polonius?
Yeah. I only want to make one comment, you gotta live a long life before you realize the fundamental truth in all of this.
Which is what? Or just all of this is that that what Hillel is saying speaks to you because you've already accumulated some years.
Back to when I was bar mitzvah, my father was absent for a number of reasons, the end of World War II, his sickness and all that. And growing up, obviously, in a very highly assimilated family. I called myself a German Jew, never mind, I couldn't call myself sort of an Austrian, Hungarian German Jew. But you realize there is a simplicity in a way that you can interpret in virtually everything that is being said. It is to me, of course it is so. Ça va, ça via, is it in French? It is so because that's the way it is.
Well,
No other.
I can only reflect on my own lived experience, in addition, of course, to whatever insights that I bring to the text from having studied Judaism with intentionality for a long time. But I think more kind of following your lead, Ivan, in terms of the way in which these texts are intended to be or function well as lifelong companions. And I can imagine that, imagine the setting here of young yeshiva bochers of the age of 14 or 15 or 16 first encountering these texts. And in one's relationship with their meaning is probably considerably different once you've actually lived a lifetime and you've accumulated the experiences and you've seen the way in which your own derekh, your own path through life, has at times been yeshara, straight, and at times, crooked. So I just want to, acknowledge that I'm grateful to know that the text is perhaps resonating with us in new ways if we're encountering it not for the first time. And for those of us who are encountering it for the first time, I'm still curious to hear from some others in the class. Does Hillel's wisdom speak to you? Do you think it is wisdom that you've applied in your own life, have absorbed in your own way, or have you suffered consequences for perhaps not following it? These are very broad themes about the meaning of a good life. So you could spend a whole lifetime kind of marinating in them. Audrey, I want to acknowledge you, and then I'm going to pick up Russell's digital hand.
I can't find the digital on my.
Don't worry about it. I see your
not
actual
able.
face. I
Thank
see your
you.
punam. It's all good.
What spoke to me was really not to judge somebody else unless have been in his or her shoes. I mean, to me, this is one of the biggest mistakes that we all make all the time, because you don't necessarily stop to think, maybe there's a reason. And I always find that I say a lot, you don't know what goes on behind somebody else's closed doors. We never have a full picture for other people's thoughts or decisions or actions.
Quite so. There's actually a fascinating and clever interpretation of that statement that's offered by the Meiri, who's a celebrated, much later rabbi, I think medieval period. I'll find out. He says on this statement, do not judge your fellow till you've stood in his or her place. He says that if you see somebody outside of his city and observing him in the outside of his city context, this person appears to be full of extraordinary virtues. do not conclude that that is his true personality. He goes on to say, you can only judge a person's character by seeing how one acts in one's place. And so he's taking this and he's kind of doing a clever reworking of what the phrase says in a kind of hyper literal way. He's saying the only way to truly understand another person's character, see how they act when they're in their place. So see how a person acts in his home before you judge. Don't judge a person just on their public statements, right? So I'll give you a nice inversion of this. 9 years ago, when I was interviewing candidates to become the next assistant rabbi of Westchester Reformed Temple, since I had been the assistant, then the associate rabbi, I was the associate rabbi with Rick, and then I was invited to become the senior rabbi. And therefore, one of my first jobs as senior rabbi was to choose an assistant rabbi. You all know, of course, Rabbi Levy came to join us. That was 9 years ago. That was 2012. And when I was doing reference checking for Rabbi Levy, you'll like this. It's a wonderful window into David Levy. I spoke with my friend, my mentor, and my Chavruta study partner, now Rabbi Jan Katsu, who had David as a pupil in his education classes at HUC. And he said, let me tell you something about David Levy. David Levy is the one student who, after every single class, stays behind to make sure the chairs are put away so that the custodians don't have to do it. So there's an example of, you don't always see everything about a person. You're not going to see that in an interview with somebody. You need to observe him or her in his place, right? In that setting where nobody else is looking, perhaps. And that is how you truly can evaluate the merit of a person. It's not actually what the text says, by the way, just so we're clear. The text says what Judy likes about it, which is that, or what Audrey likes about it, which is that you should not judge a fellow human being until you have walked a mile in his shoes, as the proverb goes. But I love this additional saying that don't judge another human being until you have seen him standing in his place, where he is not perhaps under the bright spotlights. We have a bunch of comments. So Russell, you're next, then Eve and Jay, and then anyone else, and then we'll go back to the text. So Russell, you're up.
Well, thank you very much. I'm absolutely fascinated by the admonition that we should not say something that cannot be understood in its time. Presumably, that means understood the way you meant it. In the first place, I'm not sure how the Torah stacks up when it comes to that admonition.
Right.
But I'm sort of wrestling with this. Certainly in my professional life, I admire clarity over all other features of oral and written communication. But I wonder if this recognizes that meanings change, circumstances change, language changes. I wonder whether this precludes the possibility of poetry and the sheer beauty of ambiguity, where things can mean more than one thing, even at the time when they are uttered, and the elevation of our lives and of our souls that come from that ambiguity. So I'd be very eager for your interpretation, and Frank, or for that matter, anyone in the group, as to whether or not this really is going to lead us to a better life. You're on mute. You're on mute.
How about now? Can you hear me? Did I lose y'all?
Now, yes.
Okay, great. It must have been like a blip with my new, I think I accidentally hit the digital mute key on the microphone. It's a new piece of equipment. So look, for me, I think that I would feel bereft of the beauty and mystery of our religious tradition were everything clear, understandable, and on the surface. And I think, later or concurrent rabbinic wisdom alludes to just this, in that they identify there are 4 levels of reading and analyzing and sharing a text, right? There's the pshat, and the text that's in front of us, Hillel seems to be saying, just stick to the pshat, will you? Like, just stick to the simple meaning of things, make your words as clear and understandable as possible. And I think you can only understand that in the context of the role of the rabbi in the community for, coming back to Ivan's comment, for the illiterate masses, right? You really have to, the burden is on you as the teacher to instruct in a way so that your meaning cannot be misunderstood, especially since religious authorities have power in society. And how many people think that they're doing what God or their priest or their minister or their rabbi wants of them, when in fact, look, I can visualize many Catholics across the world who are going about their lives in a certain way, and the current Pope probably, if he knew it, would say that's not what I meant at all. But much more so Jesus, right? I can picture Jesus coming back and going, "Oy vavoy, really?" Like, that's not exactly what I had in mind. So there is a burden of expectation on the religious authority to speak clearly. But having said that, there are multiple layers, and Judaism holds a cherished place for the deeper layers of interpretation for the mystery within the text, whether that is through the art of what's called drash, which is to go deep, or even sod, which is the mystical dimension of the text that caught the interest of such luminaries as Nachmanides, the Ramban, and others. So, yeah, I'm with you, Russell. I feel the same way. Eve, Jay, and Arlene.
So I was reading this earlier, and I was struck by a different part, the part that says, "Do not believe in yourself until the day you die." And at first, I really recoiled from that. And then I have the same edition of Pirkei Avot as Judy does, where in the explanations it says that it's not calling for self-disparagement or a lack of confidence, but rather we should never believe in ourselves to the extent that we are a finished product, and that we should continue learning. And that, of course, made a lot of sense to me.
That's nice. It's really nice.
So I was just taken by that and happy I was able to find an explanation that
I know I am too, and I'm glad you shared it. What edition of Pirkei Avot is this, by the way?
it's the social justice commentary, the Yanklowitz.
Oh, that's new, right? Shmuley Yanklowitz, who's a nice guy, friends with him. So let me just add here that I think in the context of Pirkei Avot that we're reading, we're not just talking about believe in yourself as a statement of self-esteem, right? This is really about accept your own opinion as the authoritative one, right? That the tradition coheres in the eyes of the rabbis who are teaching it because people submit to the authority of the rabbi or of the teacher. You put your own opinion aside in the face of a more authoritative opinion. At least I think that's a legitimate way of understanding the intention behind the text. It's my guess here. Thank you. Arlene. Oh, just unmute yourself kindly. Yes, good. Nope, you remuted yourself. You had it and then you lost it. Yep, got it.
Okay.
Good,
All right.
good.
I think that I'm always amazed at the timeliness of everything that comes out of Hillel's mouth. He speaks right now, as far as I'm concerned, in a mandate form to remind all of us to not be judgmental about what's going on in our current life in terms of political issues and in terms of understanding why people are behaving and acting or reacting in certain ways, that until we can actually identify with them, we have to instead take a different step backwards and try to just understand why they've established certain positions in their thinking.
Great. Really appreciate that. And
Yes.
the only thing I would add to your comment is not only is Hillel somehow always timely, it's because he is timeless.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
So we'll read a little bit further because actually more Hillel. So so as we look here at our text, which I'm going to bring back up onto the screen, we can see where is it? Nope. Sorry. Hang on for 1 second. I must have accidentally clicked off the tab. Oh, the skill set that rabbis are now expected to have mastered. I'm still a little bit, I can't believe this, but I'm a little bit old fashioned. Here we go. So Hillel used to say, so this is still Hillel, And section 5 begins with these words, Hu haya omer, same formula. He used to say, Ein bur yirechet. Forget about brute, which is the translation here. A boor in Hebrew, bet vav resh, this word is a boor, B-O-O-R. It's one of the handful, actually sizable handful of words in contemporary English that derive directly from biblical Hebrew or rabbinic Hebrew. So ein boor, a boor, is not a person who fears sin. Or a person, there's no such thing as a boor who fears sin. And we'll unpack that. I'm not going to tell you what it means. I want you to kind of figure out what's the relationship between being a brute, which, by the way, as we will see, it has to do with ignorance. All right, it's not about that's why I don't like brute, because brute comes from a root that means that has to do with strength. It's not about your physical strength or being an animal. It's about being unlearned, unwilling to be educated, ignorant. So an ignorant person does not fear sin. So we're going to talk about what's the link between morality and education, right? So that I've kind of I've led my witnesses very far along. I want to hear how we do with this. Velo am haaretz chasid. And an am haaretz, so what's an am haaretz? An am haaretz literally is a person of the land. But again, it kind of means an ignoramus, a schlepper, an ordinary person, a regular Joe. But it's a little bit more disparaging than a regular Joe, which can be, when people call Joe Biden, he's a regular Joe, they usually mean it as a compliment. They mean he's relatable. He seems to share the interests and background of the common folk from, Delaware or Scranton or wherever he says he's from today. But here in Am Haaretz, literally a person of the land, it's not a compliment. It's an ignoramus. Cannot be a chassid. Don't think a chassid like today. A chassid literally means a person of piety. It comes from the Hebrew word chesed, a person filled with loving kindness. So again, there's this comment about somebody who is unlettered, uneducated, ignorant, doesn't know his stuff. I'm going to keep with the masculine frame here. That person can never become a pious person. So again, what's the relationship between your letters and your morality? We're going to get to that. Velo habaishan lamed. And a person who is shy, a baishan is a person who is shy or easily embarrassed. A person who is shy or timid cannot learn, lamed. Velo hakapdan milamed. Nor can an impatient person teach. So if you are timid, you will never learn. If you are impatient, you are not qualified to teach. Velo chol hamarbe bisechora machkim. Hebrew translated here, nor will someone who engages too much in business become wise. Machkim from chokhmah. So a person who is overly engaged in ordinary business, secular business, will never become wise. Final statement. Probably my favorite statement in all of Pirkei Avot, maybe in all of Talmud, maybe in all of Judaism. Here it is, my friends. Uvemakom she'ein anashim hishtadel lehiot ish. And in a place where no one is, it literally says, in a place where there are no men, strive to be a man, but I don't like that translation. So I think idiomatically you need Yiddish for this. In a place where no one is a mensch, try to be a mensch. In a place where no one is a mensch, try to be a mensch. In a place where no one is a human being, strive to become a human being. Uvemakom she'ein anashim, in place where there are no people, but it doesn't mean devoid of bodies. It means in a place where nobody is acting like a human being. Hishtadel lehiot ish. To me, look, this changes from day to day. I'm always telling you such and so is my favorite verse of this and my favorite line of that. I recognize that I am the poster child for what Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, which is that adherence to a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. In other words, I am proudly and self-aware, and with self-awareness, I am inconsistent from day to day on this. But I will say that this is one of my favorite lines, always has been, because if somebody were to come to me and say, Rabbi, teach me Judaism on one foot, you know what Hillel says. Hillel says what is hateful to you do not do to any other person. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn it. I would make it even shorter. I would say, you want to know Judaism? In a place where no one is a mensch, be a mensch. So I want to now, because all of these have to do with the interplay between learning Judaism, teaching, being a student, and also being a mensch, being a person of good character. So Judy, you're a teacher. I want to give you pride of place and have you speak first on this subject.
Thank you so much. First of all, another word difference, a translation, very different. Our Pirkei Avot says, the last line, where there are no leaders, strive to be a leader.
Now that's too much liberty. With
Very
the text.
different.
I mean, you can read the Hebrew yourself. It says uva makom. Makom is a place. She'ein, where there are no. Anashim. Anashim are people.
Different.
Hishtadel, strive. Lihiot, to be. Ish, a man, a person, a human being. I mean, it's so straightforward. Now the meaning is, you could. I think then you could say, a valid interpretation is where nobody is stepping up to be a leader, you be the leader. Okay, I would welcome that in dialogue about the text, but I don't favor that as a translation. I feel that really puts the non-Hebrew speaker at a disadvantage. Because then, okay, so here's an example of say your meaning so that everyone can understand it, right? I'm going to call out my buddy Shmuley Yanklowitz on this one. For I think he's teaching in a way that is preventing the student from, especially the student who is not lettered in Hebrew, from fully understanding what the text actually says. Let the student decide that it means leadership and not just humanity. Okay, that's my critique.
Can I just one more as a teacher?
Please.
You are such an amazing teacher, and this is for my advice to everybody who asks me, what's a good teacher? First, you have to know your subject. And there's no question, you know your subject inside and out, and you continue to even branch out more and more. And then enthusiasm about what you know. If you're enthusiastic and you know your stuff, people are going to learn from you. They're going to want to be in your class just to catch that enthusiasm. It's contagious.
Well, so thank you. One of my teachers, thank you. I'm grateful to receive such a beautiful compliment. One of my teachers, my college roommate, Darius Lakdawala, the celebrated American healthcare economist, he once said to me, because I used to deflect very, very generous compliments like that and say, come on, no. And he just said, if somebody pays you a compliment, just say thanks, man. So thanks, man. But let me add something because I want to disclose a little bit of my personal struggle. One can learn a lot about good teaching from reading this Mishnah, from reading this Pirkei Avot. And I really, when I first encountered, or when I shouldn't say first, when in preparing for today's class, I re-encountered the line that says about the kapdan, the impatient person, the testy person, will never be a teacher or cannot teach. I felt a pang of self-recognition in that line. I feel that particularly early in my teaching, I could be very impatient with my fellow classmates. This is going back to rabbinical school especially, and with other students. Sometimes I've really had to struggle with, why aren't they getting it? And then I realized that a student not understanding something in a class is always the teacher's fault or responsibility. Always, always, always. To be a teacher means that you take full responsibility for your students' understanding. Now, the only way it goes to the student is if they don't show up. If you're not showing up, that doesn't count. But if you're showing up and doing the work, then the teacher has to make sure that the students leave without feeling like they didn't have any idea what was just communicated. So anyway, thanks for the compliment. It's very lovely to receive. Speaking of compliments, my dad wants to say something.
Of course, on behalf of your mother and me, we totally agree with everything that Judy said. But while we're on the topic of teaching, the two statements are linked. You can't learn if you're timid. You can't teach if you're impatient, and that's because the essence of the pedagogical pursuit is asking and answering questions.
Right.
If you're too timid, you won't ask questions. If you're too impatient, you'll be annoyed and you won't answer the questions.
Exactly.
So in essence, that's it.
Right. There is some burden on the student to say, excuse me, professor, I didn't understand what you just said. Could we clarify that? Or I want to know more about this, or I don't understand. Like being able to say, I don't know is the most crucial gateway. It is the gateway to learning. All good learning comes from a place of recognizing what you don't know. And that's what fuels the enthusiasm, the desire to learn more. Okay, my friends. Rick, do you have a hand up, or is that just a green check mark? iPad 9, Rick guest.
Oh, it's Nancy. I
Oh,
did.
hi.
You don't see me?
We see you.
Oh, it was way back question, but I have when we were talking about judging in the place, the person that comment.
Yes, yeah, that whole yeah.
I was
discourse.
taking that as a negative, but judging to me there is, it's not judging like giving your opinion. It's more of a negative opinion.
Yeah,
right?
let me see the Hebrew on that, just so what it says. This was in the previous Mishnah. Do not judge your fellow man. But al-tadin, yeah, it's actually the word for to judge, like to judge as in a court of law.
Right.
Din. So yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, you can't look. One person's judgment of another is always subjective. In courts of law, the burden of proof has to be demonstrated in order to render judgment. Therefore, there's a necessary or a well-taken caution about forming your opinion or expressing your opinion or expressing judgment of another person without actually having come close to the lived experience of that person. Not in a court of law necessarily, but in the day-to-day.
I don't think that's always possible. You can't always.
Of course it's not.
Right. That's the problem. You can't. You
Right.
can try to imagine or put yourself in a situation and how the person is dealing with their situation, but you may not.
Completely agree. Yeah, you can't. And yet, so this is more about, remember, these texts are as much about character formation as they are about specific guidelines for how to learn and live as a Jew. And that's why I'm fascinated by the way in which Hillel explores the linkages between education and character, right? So what we're looking at in these texts here is a kind of far-ranging discourse on can an ignorant person be virtuous, or its opposite? Can a learned person? And there's a Venn diagram almost. It's like, look, learning is not itself an indicator of virtue. We know that because of Nazi scientists, among other things, right? I mean, during the Holocaust, though, especially for those of us who are post-Holocaust Jews, we can observe that there is not necessarily a correlative link between one's smarts, and even one's education, and one's morality, one's character, because we saw extraordinarily well-educated monsters who actually harnessed their learning to produce mass genocide. However, that's not what the text says. We should be careful not to draw an inference, it's an illogical inference to draw from the opposite of what the text says. What the text says is that an ignorant person cannot be a person who fears sin. In other words, an ignorant person can never be fully virtuous. And that's a provocative statement, I think. It's one that I think Hasidic Judaism actually disparages, because the Hasidim were opposed to the Litvak, the Lithuanian, or the Mitnagdim approach to Judaism, which is that unless you are a Talmud scholar, you'll never really be a righteous Jew. And it's the famous story of the young boy who doesn't know any Hebrew, but he comes to shul and all he can do is play his flute, right? And that's his song. And the rabbi, and in this little folktale, I think it's in the Old Gates of Prayer book, in this folktale, the rabbi wants the flute to be heard, right? It's not a disruption to the worship because it's the way this boy communicates. I think about this all the time when we are invited, because of our relationship with a family who belongs to the congregation, to sanctify and celebrate a child's bar mitzvah when the child has autism or other developmental disabilities. In my view, it's still a bar mitzvah, and the person, through no fault of his own, is ignorant of so much Jewish learning. And yet at the same time, you meet the child where he is, and you affirm that he too is a mensch and has his place among the Jewish people. So I can pick this apart. But on the other hand, I can also understand where Hillel's coming from, that in the Jewish tradition, there actually is a strong correlation between growing in learning and growing in menschlichkeit. And I think that this exploration, this is really a text about what does it take to be a mensch, as much as it is about what does it mean to be a person who is learned, both a learner and a teacher. I mean, there's a lot in this text. It's multiple statements. Each kind of contains worlds unto itself. But any other thoughts on this one? Just because there's so much going on that we could mine. Particularly, I want to know what you think about Bamakom she'ein anashim hishtadel lehiyot ish, in a place where no one is a person. Would you try to be a person, please?
Rabbi?
Yeah.
It seems to me that the previous section, with all the admonitions about judgment and lead up to this last line of in a place where nobody is a person or a mensch, strive to be a mensch, because those are all parts of being a good human being.
Yeah. And it comes, by the way, at the end of a segment where he has also just said, don't divorce yourself from the community.
Right.
Right. So part of living a Jewish life is not easily conducted in isolation. This was a real life dilemma for me at my first student pulpit, which is in West Virginia. It's a congregation. It's no longer, the congregation actually closed its doors. I recently learned in 2012, which made me feel a little bit sad. But I served a congregation in Beckley, West Virginia. In Williamson, West Virginia. 8-member families. It was the smallest congregation in the Union of Reform Judaism, which was at then called the UAHC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And 8-member families living on the border between West Virginia and Kentucky, Eastern Kentucky. And how hard it is to be Jewish in that context. But yeah, of course, you can have a Seder for 3 and you can have a Friday night service without a minyan. But Judaism is a communal practice. And I think Hillel's attentive to that, yes, personal piety, but at the end of the day, Jewish life is lived in community. And beyond that, it's not only lived in Jewish community. Judaism is a practice where we are in community at some level or another with people who are not like us, who don't think the same way, who don't have the same beliefs, mores, rituals, holidays, calendar, way of marking time, diet, dress. I mean, so much, particularly for observant Jewish communities in the ancient milieu that I've been trying to describe this morning. So in that context, that's where Hillel's statement really stands out. Given that you have to live in public, you may therefore be a participant in the behavior of a mob that is decidedly un-Jewish, not just in composition, but un-Jewish in character. And that's when the statement really becomes important, maybe even a matter of life and death, that in a place where nobody is being a human being, ultimately as a Jew, your foremost charge is that's when you have to be a human being. So I think that this is really I could preach this 100 different ways, right? But I think this is really a comment on what it means to be a Jew among a mob. It's endlessly rich in its possibilities. I hope that it will stick with you as deeply in your kishkas as it has with me. My dad, your hand is up.
Isn't it, excuse me, isn't it wonderful that the text doesn't say, for instance, like in a Christian context, be a saint? It says, be a human being. This is an achievable goal. It's not, extraordinary or impossible to reach.
Yeah. It doesn't even say be a good Jew. It says just try to be a person, would you?
Be a human, be nice.
Right.
As you've taught before.
Right. And that's why I find the themes that echo this come up in a lot of Jewish texts. The one that I've taught last Yom Kippur, I mentioned this in last week's class about the rabbi whose pupils buy him a donkey so that he can make his flax trade more efficient and therefore have more time to study Torah with them, which again, now, especially in the context of this Hillel set of teachings, makes even more sense. Of course, you want the rabbi to have more time to teach, and you want his pupils to have more time to learn, because a life of study is a big part of the derekh yeshara. If you haven't gotten that Hebrew phrase by now, I'll keep repeating it, but it's the right path, the straight path. And I'm using that language because it's better untranslated than it is translated. So a big part of the derekh yeshara is having time for Torah study. But when the rabbi realizes that his students have appropriated this donkey with a jewel that the Gentile merchant who sold it to them may not have even known was taken with his animal, they say, well, does he know about it? And he said, no. And what harm will it do? And the response of their teacher, Shimon ben Shetach, who's one of Hillel's predecessors, by the way, I believe, but same basic timeline, not a rabbi, but venerated by the rabbis of Pirkei Avot as one of their kind of preeminent early sages. Shimon ben Shetach says, who do you think I am? A barbarian. That's his language. He doesn't even get into the jots and tittles of Jewish law. There's something higher here, right? It's like, wait a minute. Yeah, I get it that, yeah, you're allowed finders, keepers, losers, weepers. We can make a halachic argument that supports keeping the gem that the Gentile merchant doesn't know he gave away with his donkey. But what do you think I am? What kind of a person would that make me? And again, there's something beyond Jewish law. It's called menschlichkeit. And that's really important. Like, like we don't want the students growing up at WRT in our wonderful Jewish Learning Lab, and even in the advanced scholarship program that we inaugurated last year called the Rabbis Table, which has been a real joy. And I want to give a lot of love and my deepest appreciation to our congregant and board member, Amy Bauman, who established this program in memory of her son, Sam, who was, if ever there were a fearless and joyful Jewish learner, I have never met a learner like Sam, may his memory be for a blessing. But at the end of the day, Judaism prizes something even above scholarship, and that's being a mensch. And that we're going to spend 2 more minutes in class, but I don't want to allow that not to be our Nechemta today. Mara, will you please chime in? Mara Steiner.
So I understand in the context of living in a community or in a world where not everyone may be Jewish or not the same kind of Jewish, but what about in a community where it's all Orthodox people and everybody lives together? And is there some excuse that this doesn't really apply because everyone's supposed to be a mensch?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's where my paucity of familiarity with life in the Haredi world from the inside is really going to hamper us from going too far into the possibilities that your question raises. So, I don't know. I actually take very seriously the milieu in which I believe these texts are being written and shared, which is, as I've suggested, a milieu with considerably more interchange between Jews and non-Jews than was originally thought. And and Orthodox Jews, I think, not all, but many Haredim especially, believe that the norm of Jewish life from Mount Sinai to the present day has always been self-ghettoized, right? That we must, in order to maintain the integrity of our principles, our faith, our community, we must live a life apart. And the real question is that the norm of Jewish life, or is that a kind of artificially imposed hedge against what is perceived as the perilousness of modernity? Let me try and unpack that just so I don't violate Pirkei Avot and teach something that won't be understood. My premise is that self-isolation is not the exclusive, or even the dominant condition of Jewish life throughout most of Jewish history. Now, at times, it has been imposed from externally upon us, right? When we fled the Inquisition and came to Italy, we were put into ghettos, the word coming from a word that might mean the iron foundry, the shitty part of town, the slums. And these were walled in. Like the Warsaw Ghetto was not the first ghetto. They got that from the Italians in the 15th century. So but is that the norm for Jewish life? I mean, in certain ways, Judaism is self-exclusionary. We withdraw ourselves from big parts of secular interchange by saying we have our own dietary laws. We have to be in prayer 3 times a day, if you're Orthodox, right? So there are we dress differently if you're, again, observant in the way Orthodox Jews have throughout most of history been observant. So there are ways in which Jews, of course, are putting up their own walls. But I don't think that the Haredi approach to Jewish life today of basically recreating 16th century Poland in Brooklyn or Muncie is representative of the original intentions behind Jewish texts that talk about what it means to live a Jewish life. I am not, for one, persuaded that the original rabbinic vision of Judaism is that we would be living a life hermetically sealed off from the corrupting influences of the secular world. But, you know, if you watch Diesel, you know that they don't use smartphones in part, or that smartphones are taboo. Lipa Weiss, Gitti's husband, has a smartphone, and it's a taboo. It's a shanda a little bit because you can get the internet on it. And you might learn things that the Orthodox community, that the Haredi community doesn't want you learning. And you might access pornography and other things that are really taboo. So all of that is to say that part of Haredi life, again, respectfully, from the outside looking in, seems to me to be doing everything in their power to say that the most or the only authentic way to lead the derekh yeshara, the right path, the Jewish path through life, is to make of yourselves an exclusive island where your only interactions will be with Jews, and then you won't have to deal with all the stuff that's difficult about living in a world with non-Jews. But I'm not really sure that that's actually what the rabbis intended. As I read these texts here today, I think the rabbis are preparing other rabbis, their disciples, and maybe even the illiterate Jewish masses for a life lived with people who are not like them. It's a fascinating way of bringing us full circle, and I'm so glad you raised it. Okay, my dad, you're going to get the last word before I get the final say, unless Joe Levine has something as well.
I only gave you a thumbs up because I.
Oh, great. That's a real thumbs up. Joe, do you want to chime in?
I don't know if I can say this quickly, but I know time is limited. Russell said something earlier in the discussion about his appreciation because of his occupation to clarity. His word clarity in terms of understanding what people say or trying to teach something reminded me of Judy. Judy and I share the responsibility and a tremendous burden of making what we say clear to classes of 25 or 30 at one time. And then Judy said something which I'm sure everybody in this group said amen to, and that you're such a tremendous teacher because you make things so clear and understandable. And really, really, it's a blessing to your parents, who I had the privilege of sitting next to in one of the services.
Why do you think I invite them to come to my class? It's not for me. I want them to hear you. So I want to hear you felling about me. Thank you.
Mr. and Mrs. Blake, thank you for giving us the blessing of Jonathan.
Thank you.
So very welcome.
They're very happy to share me with the congregation of Westchester Reformed Temple. Let me add here, though, and this is yes, it's self-deprecating humor. I hope it's not intended to cancel out any of the encomia, which I am most grateful to hear this morning. Thank you, my friends. But you know that line that I taught you from the Meiri, the rabbi who said, you don't judge a person till you see him in his place. Clearly, none of you have ever seen me as a teacher of 6th graders. It's just, and I will tell you, it can be a joy, but I can become a real pain in the tuchus because I love learning so much. And I think there's so much joy to be found in exploring and learning and studying the Jewish tradition that it hurts my soul a little bit when I have people who just don't care or who are tired or who just want a snack. And 6th graders are just really hard, man. Joe, you've been a coach, you've been a teacher for years and years and years of young people. They can bring you so much nachas, and they can also bring you so many headaches. So part of the reason, perhaps, that I'm coming off smelling like a rose in this class is because you're all such engaged students. And on that note, my friends, we have come to the end of today's study. Next week, we'll pick up with Hillel playing the part of who, oh gosh, back to Hamlet now. Who is it that picks up Yorick's skull? Oh, it's Hamlet. Hamlet. He picks up Yorick's skull and he says, "Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest," right? So we have the Yorick moment in the next Pirkei Avot. If you have a book, you'll see that Hillel comes across a skull floating on the water, and it prompts his thinking. So we're going to pick up with Hillel and the famous skull, not of Yorick, but of some mystery figure, and it's a very weird passage. So brace yourself for some weirdness. In the meantime, let me invite you, please, to look to your e-blast, which went out this morning. There's a lot happening coming up in person at WRT and also online. Everything from an exploration of the Jews of India, a 3,000-year under-celebrated civilization of Judaism, taught by our congregants Howard and Iris Burkett, who've done the Jewish travel to India and led trips many, many times. So you're going to want to participate in that. I think that's either this or next Friday. Co-sponsored or sponsored by our WRJ.
It's
And then
this Friday.
This Friday afternoon. Thank you, Carol. And then Friday night is our High Society Shabbat, where we will welcome the class of 2002, people who joined the temple in 2020, because they were supposed to celebrate in the fall, but we delayed to the spring on account of COVID. We're still not able to gather in person, but I'll be broadcasting from the Bima. Next Friday, however, is the first opportunity to return to Friday night services in person. We would read the fine print in the email that I sent to the congregation yesterday, and that's in the e-blast this morning. It tells you how we are going to do a fair, inclusive, equitable, and safe return to the campus. And it is a little bit first come, first serve, with priority also given to people who are commemorating a yard site or celebrating a life cycle. So if you know today that you're really interested in signing up to be back on campus for an outdoor, please God, service next Friday night, the 30th of April, then don't delay in signing up, because I expect a lot of people will want the same thing. All right, that's all I've got for you. Have a wonderful week. Shabbat shalom in advance, and I'll see you very soon.
Yes,
Bye, everyone. Baruch Tiyeh. Bye-bye.